What are your objections to aid?
It's not so much my objections to aid, but my objections to the form which aid takes. Normally, the countries giving aid insist on your using up practically all of the aid which they give in purchase of their goods and services. And as a former president of the World Bank has pointed out, this normally means a loss of about 1 shilling in the pound of aid to the recipient of aid.
Some of the donors or lenders of money for your seawall project, notably Britain, do allow a proportion, I think it's 40% of the money they give you, to be spent locally, don't they?
Well, that was in the case of the British. They have not been as bad as the others. But the other objection, of course, is that they prefer to identify the projects in which you'll spend aid rather than giving what we want, which is program aid for an entire development program.
It sometimes appears that within the poor countries of the world, that a sort of rhetoric is used, particularly in addressing large audiences, with slogans that aid is exploitation, that aid is raid, and so forth, which must rather discourage the donor nations.
Well, in my case, it's not idle rhetoric. It arises from a study of our facts. And that is why we have placed greater emphasis on national self-reliance. Because in my view, aid can never build a country. It dehumanizes the individuals and makes them lose confidence in themselves.
Well, if aid can't bridge the gap between the rich world and the poor world, what can the poor countries do to bridge the gap?
As I see it, there are two principal things to be done, at least, or possibly three. One, there must be a greater self-reliance and involvement of the people in the case of each of the poor nations. Two, there must be a more concerted and definitive attempt to increase the flow of trade between developing countries. And thirdly, the developing countries ought to have a rather uniform policy so that when there are resources in their countries which the rich countries want, the rich countries will be made to pay for them fairly and adequately.
Do you think the poor countries can achieve these rearrangements?
Well, I think if they don't achieve it, they'll perish.
Do you believe that there's no altruism in aid?
Very little, if any.
You don't think that the taxpayers who contribute and that the governments who persuade them to contribute are doing so out of a spirit of trying to help?
Maybe the taxpayers, but certainly not the governments. But incidentally, I don't quarrel about this. We live in a materialist world.
Prime Minister, this year you took over a large Canadian-owned bauxite company in this country. Has that resulted in pressures from the rich world on you?
Oh, it certainly has. First of all, we have the pressures from the company itself, running down machinery and equipment, making it difficult at first for us to get inputs. And then the United States representative from the World Bank opposed a World Bank loan to us for sea defenses. And there have been all sorts of pressures. We negotiated a loan with the United States recently, and then suddenly they said they'll have to reconsider the matter for another 7 months or thereabouts.
Why did you take over the company?
Because it is my conviction, my government's policy, and my people's belief that Guyana and all other countries like Guyana ought to own and control their natural resources. These resources in bauxite, which are some of the richest in the world, in quality and in quantity, have been exploited by outsiders, and we have got the minimal benefits. And we proposed to the company that we took over the majority holdings. Apparently their power psychology precluded their being able to accept that, and we had to nationalize them. That's all. It's ours.
Prime Minister, many countries in the Caribbean, though I know not so much Guyana, have been forced to look to tourism for development. Do you see tourism as a helpful development?
Well, every country must use what resources it has. Fortunately for us, God gave us dirty, murky waters, and we don't have to be the subject of these tourists. Tourism, to my mind, for Guyana is not a good thing at this stage, because it means the importation of false and wrong values and the creation of a nation of waiters. Tourism, I think, can be all right after the country has built its own economy and has an ethic, mores of its own, and then you can afford to let people come all around the place.